I was the nanny who passed out beside his sextuplets. I carried the weight of 6 tiny lives in my arms, even as no one held mine. When I finally collapsed, the silence I left behind spoke louder than any word I'd ever spoken. Maybe you're taking care of children whose parents never notice your efforts, or cleaning up while the house is quiet. Tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? I promise, today's story will touch your heart. My name is Margaret, but everyone called me Maggie. I am 72 years old now, and my hands still remember the weight of those 6 babies. My fingers still know the exact temperature of a bottle at 3 in the morning. My ears still wake to phantom cries that no longer exist. This is my story, the story of a woman who loved children that weren't hers more than some people love their own. It was October 2018 when I first walked through those heavy oak doors of the Pemberton brownstone on East 78th Street. The Upper East Side of Manhattan stretched around me like a museum of wealth, every building whispering stories of old money, new fortunes, and dreams built on Wall Street investments. The autumn leaves crunched under my worn black shoes as I climbed those stone steps, my heart pounding with a mixture of hope and desperation. I was 67 then, and this was supposed to be my last job. My retirement savings had evaporated when my daughter's medical bills consumed every dollar I'd managed to save. The stock market crash of 2008 had already taken half my 401k, and what little remained went to keeping her alive for one more year. One more precious year that ended anyway, leaving me broke and broken. Alexander Pemberton answered the door himself that first day, tall, silver-haired, with the kind of confidence that only comes from generational wealth and successful cryptocurrency investments. His fortune was built on early Bitcoin purchases and a diverse portfolio that included everything from tech stocks to European assets. He looked at me the way wealthy people look at household staff, not unkindly, but with the distant politeness reserved for useful objects. "Mrs. Douglas," he said, extending a manicured hand, "thank you for coming. I trust the agency explained our unique situation. 6 babies, 6 perfect, premature miracles born after years of fertility treatments that cost more than most people's houses." His wife, Elena, had suffered complications during delivery and was still recovering in a private clinic in Switzerland, receiving treatment that insurance wouldn't cover, but their vast fortune could easily absorb. The nursery took my breath away. 6 cribs arranged in a perfect circle, each one holding a tiny bundle no bigger than my forearm. The late afternoon sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across imported Italian marble floors. The air smelled of baby powder and that peculiar scent of new life, sweet, innocent, utterly defenseless. "They need round-the-clock care," Alexander explained, his voice carrying the weight of someone unaccustomed to vulnerability. "The previous nanny couldn't handle the workload. These are special children, Mrs. Douglas. They require someone exceptional." 4 girls and 2 boys, Isabella, Sophia, Lily, Grace, James, and William. I memorized their names before I memorized their faces, whispering them like a prayer as I reached into cribs that cost more than most people's cars. Isabella was the smallest, barely 4 pounds, with tiny fingers that gripped mine with surprising strength. Sophia had the loudest cry, demanding attention with the authority of someone born into privilege. Lily was the quiet one, watchful even as a newborn. Grace smiled first, a toothless grin that broke my heart wide open. James was the mischief maker from day one, somehow managing to kick off every blanket I tucked around him. And William looked at me with knowing eyes, as if he understood that I was his anchor in a world of paid caregivers and emotional distance. The schedule was brutal. Feedings every 2 hours around the clock, diaper changes that seemed endless, baths that required the precision of a surgical procedure, medications at exact times, temperature checks, weight measurements, sleep schedules that meant I never slept more than 90 minutes at a stretch. My room was in the basement, a converted space that smelled faintly of mothballs and old radiator heat. The furnishings were sparse but functional: a narrow bed, a small dresser, a chair that creaked when I sat down to fold the mountains of tiny laundry. There was one small window that looked out onto an air shaft, and sometimes at night I would press my face against the glass and try to see stars through the slice of Manhattan sky visible above. But I didn't mind the basement room or the exhaustion or the 18-hour days. I minded the invisible walls that surrounded me in that house. I minded the way conversations stopped when I entered a room. I minded being introduced as the help to dinner guests who looked through me as if I were furniture. I minded eating my meals alone in the kitchen while the family dining room glowed with crystal and candlelight just 20 feet away. Most of all, I minded the way Alexander spoken about his children as if they were investments to be managed rather than souls to be nurtured. "Isabella's weight gain is below projections," he would say, reviewing charts with the detachment of a financial analyst studying dividend returns. "James seems to be exceeding developmental milestones. Good for the portfolio." The portfolio. As if these babies were commodities in his vast collection of assets. But children see truth in ways adults learn to ignore. Within weeks, I was the one they reached for when they cried. I was the voice that soothed them back to sleep. I was the hands that knew exactly how to hold them when their tiny bodies seized with colic. I was the one who sang lullabies my own grandmother had sung to me, back when I was small enough to believe the world was safe. "Hush now, little one," I would whisper, rocking Isabella through another sleepless night. "Maggie's here. Maggie's always here." And I was. I was there for first smiles and first teeth. I was there when Lily took her first shaky steps in the marble foyer, her chubby hands reaching toward me with absolute trust. I was there when Sophia spoke her first word, not Mama or Papa, but Maggie. I was there when Grace learned to clap and James discovered he could make me laugh by making silly faces. I was there, but I was also invisible. The Pembertons entertained frequently. Dinner parties where Manhattan's elite gathered to discuss hedge fund performance and international markets over wine that cost more per bottle than I made in a week. I would serve appetizers and collect empty glasses, moving through their world like a shadow. Sometimes I caught fragments of conversation about their expanding business empire, new investments in emerging markets, or plans to diversify their portfolio with additional real estate holdings. "Alexander, darling," I heard one woman say, her diamonds catching the chandelier light, "you simply must tell us about your latest venture. I heard you made millions in that biotech stock." He would smile modestly, swirling his brandy. Just good timing and better research, though I must say having the children has made me more conservative with certain investments. They're my real treasure now. His real treasure. As if having 6 babies had been a conscious decision to diversify his holdings rather than the desperate attempt at parenthood it had actually been. I watched these conversations from the kitchen doorway, my hands busy with dishes while my heart absorbed the casual cruelty of his words. These children he called treasure were sleeping upstairs, and not one of his guests had asked to see them. Not one had inquired about their health or development. They were abstract concepts, like art or jewelry, valuable possessions to be mentioned in conversation but not actually engaged with. Elena returned from Switzerland when the babies were 4 months old. She was beautiful in that brittle way of women who have spent decades maintaining their appearance for other people's comfort. Her recovery had restored her physical health, but not her connection to the children she'd carried. She spoke to them in the same tone she used with the housekeeper, kind but impersonal, as if they were particularly important houseguests. "Mrs. Douglas," she said one morning, watching me prepare bottles with practiced efficiency, "you've done remarkable work with them. Alexander mentioned you have experience with multiple children." 6 grandchildren, I lied smoothly. The truth, that my only child had died without giving me grandchildren, that these 6 babies were filling a void so deep it had threatened to swallow me whole. Wasn't something wealthy employers needed to hear. She nodded approvingly. Excellent. We're planning a trip to the Hamptons next month. 3 weeks. You'll manage everything, of course. We've hired a local catering service, so you'll just need to focus on the children. 3 weeks alone with 6 7-month-old babies in a house I'd never seen, with no backup help and no one to call if something went wrong. The isolation would be complete, but I agreed because what choice did I have? This job was my lifeline, and lifelines don't come with negotiation rights. The Hampton house was larger than the Manhattan brownstone, all white walls and ocean views that should have been calming, but somehow felt vast and empty. The nursery overlooked the beach, and during the day I would open the windows so the babies could hear the rhythm of the waves. It was there, in that oversized house filled with priceless art and investment pieces that Elena had acquired over the years, that I realized how completely I had disappeared into these children's lives. My own reflection had become foreign to me. When I looked in the bathroom mirror each morning, I saw tired eyes and gray hair that I never had time to properly style. I saw hands that were always busy, always reaching for someone else's needs. I saw a woman who had become a function rather than a person. But then, Isabella would grab my finger with both her tiny hands, or James would giggle when I made funny voices during his bath, and I would remember why invisibility was a small price to pay for this kind of love. The collapse happened on a Tuesday in August. I remember because it was garbage day, and I had been listening to the sound of trucks rumbling down the street while I prepared the morning bottles. The babies were 15 months old then, walking and climbing and getting into everything their curious minds could imagine. The safety gates I installed seemed inadequate against their combined determination to explore every corner of their world. I had been running on 3 hours of sleep for 6 consecutive days. Lily had been teething and crying inconsolably during her usual sleep hours. Sophia had developed a stomach bug that required constant monitoring and frequent outfit changes. James had learned to climb out of his crib and would roam the nursery like a tiny escape artist, waking his siblings with his adventures. I was in the kitchen, warming bottles and mentally calculating how many loads of laundry waited in the basement, when the world began to tilt sideways. The marble countertop felt cold against my palm as I gripped it, trying to steady myself. Black spots danced at the edges of my vision, and my knees became unreliable. The last thing I remember clearly was the sound of bottles hitting the floor, formula splashing across Italian tiles that cost more per square foot than most people's monthly rent. Then the world went dark, and I fell beside those scattered bottles like just another broken thing in a house full of expensive, fragile objects. When I opened my eyes, 6 worried faces peered down at me from the safety gate at the kitchen entrance. Isabella was crying, her small hands pressed against the white wooden bars. The others watched with the serious expressions children wear when they sense something is wrong in their carefully ordered world. Alexander found us there 20 minutes later. Me on the floor, slowly sitting up and checking for injuries, surrounded by spilled formula and 6 babies who had somehow managed to comfort themselves in my absence. His face cycled through surprise, concern, and something that might have been guilt before settling on the practiced neutrality he wore like expensive cologne. "Mrs. Douglas," he said, stepping carefully around the puddles of formula, "are you injured? Should I call someone?" "I'm fine," I said automatically, the same response I'd given to every ache and pain for the past 2 years. "Just got a little dizzy. I'll clean this up." But as I struggled to my feet, using the counter for support, I saw something shift in his expression. For just a moment, the wealthy businessman facade cracked, and I glimpsed the frightened father underneath. These 6 children, his portfolio of human treasures, had been 30 seconds away from a true emergency, with no one but their 70-year-old caregiver to depend on. Maybe you should rest today, he said carefully. I can call the agency for temporary help. No. The word came out sharper than I intended. They don't know the children. Isabella still won't take her bottle from strangers. James has that ear infection medication that needs to be given every 6 hours. Lily needs her security blanket arranged just so for her afternoon nap. I spoke with the authority of someone who had cataloged every preference, every fear, every small need of 6 small humans. I spoke with the voice of irreplaceable knowledge, and for the first time in 2 years, Alexander Pemberton really heard me. That night, after the children were asleep and the kitchen was restored to its pristine state, he knocked on my basement door. I was sitting in my creaky chair, mending tiny clothes by the light of a table lamp that barely pushed back the shadows. "Come in," I said, not looking up from the small shirt in my hands. Isabella had outgrown it, but I couldn't bear to throw it away. Soon she would be too big for my lap, too independent for bedtime stories, too grown up for the songs that had become as natural to me as breathing. He sat on the edge of my narrow bed, looking around the sparse room as if seeing it for the first time. His gaze lingered on the small collection of drawings taped to my wall, stick figures with crayon smiles that spelled out, "I love Maggie," in James's careful handwriting. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "about what happened today, about what could have happened." I set down the shirt and really looked at him. In the dim light of my basement room, stripped of his usual expensive suit and confident posture, he looked older than his 53 years, tired, almost fragile. "The children were fine," I said gently. "Children are more resilient than we think. But what if they hadn't been? What if one of them had been hurt while you were unconscious? What if—" He stopped, running his hands through his silver hair. "Christ, Mrs. Douglas, I don't even know your first name." "Margaret," I said quietly, "but everyone calls me Maggie." "Maggie." He tested the name like he was learning a new language. "Tell me about yourself, Maggie. Tell me who you are when you're not taking care of my children." The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications neither of us wanted to examine too closely. Who was I when I wasn't caring for his children? I couldn't remember. It had been so long since anyone had asked about Margaret Douglas, the person rather than Mrs. Douglas, the nanny, that I barely recognized myself outside this role. I had a daughter, I heard myself say, Sarah. She would have been 45 this year. Would have been. Past tense, like so much of my life. She died when she was 38. Cancer. The word still tasted bitter in my mouth, even after 9 years. I spent everything I had trying to save her. Everything. My retirement fund, my house, my husband's life insurance policy. I sold jewelry my grandmother had given me, furniture that had been in the family for generations. I liquidated mutual funds and cashed in bonds and borrowed against everything I could find to borrow against. Alexander listened without interrupting, his expression growing more somber with each word. The experimental treatments weren't covered by insurance. The specialists wanted payment up front. The medications cost more than most people's salaries. I picked up Isabella's shirt again, smoothing the tiny sleeves. I would have sold my soul if I thought it would have bought her one more day. "But it wasn't enough," he said softly. "It's never enough, is it?" I met his eyes across the small room. All the money in the world, all the investments and assets and diversified portfolios, and they can't buy the one thing that matters most. We sat in silence for a moment, two people who had discovered the brutal limits of wealth and will. "After she died, I had nothing," I continued. "No savings, no house, no pension, just debt and grief and the knowledge that I was too old to start over, but too broke to give up. The agency found me this job, and your children—" I touched the crayon drawing on my wall. "Your children gave me a reason to wake up in the morning." "They love you," Alexander said, and there was something like wonder in his voice. "More than they love Elena or me. They cry when you leave the room. They smile when they hear your voice. Isabella said Maggie before she said Papa. I hadn't known he'd noticed. I hadn't known he'd been watching closely enough to see the bonds that had formed despite every professional boundary I'd tried to maintain. I lost my child, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But your children. They've been healing something in me I didn't think could be healed. Every time I hold them, every time I sing them to sleep, every time they reach for me when they're scared or hurt or lonely, it's like Sarah is still here somehow. Like the love I had for her has found somewhere new to live. That's when I saw it. The crack in his armor that let emotion leak through. His eyes filled with tears he probably hadn't shed since his own father's funeral, and his voice broke when he spoke. I don't know how to love them the way you do, he admitted. I look at them and I see responsibility, legacy, the future of everything I've built. But you look at them and see, what do you see, Maggie? I see 6 miracles who need someone to believe in them unconditionally, I said. I see personalities emerging and preferences forming and little souls that need to know they're cherished just for existing, not for what they might achieve or inherit or become. I see children who need to feel safe enough to make mistakes, loved enough to take risks, valued enough to develop confidence. I gestured toward the drawings on my wall. When James gave me that picture, he wasn't thinking about his trust fund or his future net worth. He was thinking that he wanted to make the person who reads him bedtime stories smile. That's love, Mr. Pemberton. Pure, uncomplicated, generous love. Something fundamental shifted between us that night. Not romance. I was a 70-year-old domestic worker, and he was a wealthy widower. 2 decades younger, with a life that moved in circles I could never inhabit. But understanding, recognition, the acknowledgement that I was more than a service provider, and he was more than just another demanding employer. Over the following weeks, things changed in small but significant ways. He started calling me Maggie instead of Mrs. Douglas. He asked about my day and listened to my answers. He stopped treating the children's developmental updates like quarterly earnings reports and started asking about their personalities, their preferences, their individual quirks and charms. But most importantly, he started really seeing them, not as investments or legacy projects, but as the small, complex people they were becoming. James, the escape artist, was also incredibly empathetic. He would bring his favorite stuffed elephant to whichever sibling was crying, as if his comfort object might help them too. Sophia, the loudest and most demanding, was also the most protective. She positioned herself between smaller children and strangers, like a tiny bodyguard. Lily, the quiet observer, had an almost supernatural ability to sense emotions and would pat my hand when she noticed I looked tired. Isabella, Grace, and William each revealed their own unique personalities as they moved from infancy toward toddlerhood. Isabella was the diplomat, already learning to negotiate between her siblings' competing demands. Grace was the performer, dancing and singing before she could properly walk. William was the thinker, studying everything with scientific intensity before making his next move. Watching Alexander discover these aspects of his children was like watching someone fall in love for the first time. The wonder in his eyes when Lily brought him a book to read, the pride when James shared his elephant voluntarily, the soft smile when Grace performed her latest dance creation. These moments transformed him from employer to father right before my eyes. But fairy tale transformations don't happen in real life, at least not completely. The fundamental structure of our relationship remained unchanged. I was still the hired help, still living in the basement, still eating my meals alone while the family shared theirs upstairs. The emotional intimacy we'd discovered that night in my room existed in a separate space from the practical reality of my position in his household. Elena noticed the change immediately when she returned from another medical retreat in Europe. Her husband was spending more time in the nursery, taking genuine interest in their children's daily activities and asking questions about their development that went beyond mere data points. "Alexander seems quite taken with the children lately," she commented one morning, watching through the kitchen window as he helped me set up an outdoor play area in the small courtyard behind the brownstone. "They're at a wonderful age," I replied diplomatically, "very interactive, full of personality." She studied me with the calculating look of someone accustomed to managing potential threats to her position. "Yes, I suppose they are. And you've been instrumental in their development, haven't you, Mrs. Douglas?" The return to my formal name felt like a step backward, but I maintained professional neutrality. "I've tried to provide consistent, nurturing care." Elena sipped her coffee, imported from some small farm in Costa Rica that probably cost more per pound than most people's weekly grocery budget. "I've been thinking it might be time to transition them to a proper educational program. Montessori, perhaps, or one of those early learning academies." "What do you think?" What I thought was that 6 18-month-old children needed stability, routine, and the security of familiar caregivers more than they needed educational programming. What I thought was that Elena was feeling displaced by her husband's newfound attention to the children and was looking for ways to reassert control. What I thought was that any major changes to their environment would undo months of careful emotional development. What I said was, "They're still very young for formal programming. Perhaps we could introduce some structured activities at home first?" "Perhaps." But her tone suggested the decision had already been made, and my input was more courtesy than actual consultation. That afternoon, I overheard Elena on the phone with someone she addressed as "darling," discussing enrollment procedures and waiting lists and the social advantages of certain prestigious programs. The conversation was peppered with casual mentions of tuition costs that made my head spin. $30,000 per child per year for part-time preschool programs that wouldn't even start until they turned 2. $60,000 annually just for 3 of the children to spend 4 hours a day somewhere other than home. The casual way she discussed these expenses, as if they were barely worth calculating, reminded me how different our worlds were. My entire annual salary was less than 1 semester's tuition for Isabella alone. But it wasn't the money that worried me. It was the disruption. These 6 children had never been separated from each other or from me for more than a few hours. Their sense of security was built on predictable routines and familiar faces. Suddenly, introducing institutional care with strangers who would see them as just another set of wealthy, demanding clients could undo everything we'd accomplished. That night, Alexander found me in the nursery, rocking William through what had become a nightly ritual. The other 5 were already asleep, but William had always been my most sensitive child, requiring extra comfort before he could settle. "Elena mentioned educational programs," he said quietly, settling into the chair beside me. "Yes, she seems quite interested in early enrollment." He watched me adjust William's position so his head rested more comfortably against my shoulder. "What do you think? Are they ready for something like that?" This was the test, the moment when my professional opinion would either be valued or dismissed based on how well it aligned with decisions that had already been made. "I think they're ready for new challenges and learning opportunities," I said carefully, "but I also think they need those challenges to come gradually, with plenty of security and continuity. Big changes can be overwhelming at this age." William's breathing had finally settled into the deep rhythm of sleep, but I continued rocking, unwilling to break the peaceful moment. "They're very attached to you," Alexander observed. "Attachment is healthy at their age. It means they feel safe enough to explore and learn because they trust that their secure base will be there when they need it." "And if that secure base disappears?" The question hung between us, loaded with implications we both understood but neither wanted to voice directly. If Elena succeeded in transitioning the children to full-time institutional care, my position would become redundant. If my role was reduced to occasional babysitting or eliminated entirely, the disruption to their emotional development could be significant. Children are resilient, I said finally, but resilience is built on a foundation of security. Remove the foundation too quickly, and the whole structure becomes wobbly. Over the next several weeks, Elena moved forward with her educational plans with the efficiency of someone accustomed to making executive decisions. Phone calls were made, appointments scheduled, deposits paid. The children would start at the Riverside Academy for early learning in September, just after their second birthdays. I helped prepare them as best I could, reading books about school and playing games that involved separating into small groups. But I could see the confusion in their eyes when I tried to explain that they would spend their days with new people in a new place while Maggie stayed home. "Maggie come too?" Isabella asked, her small hand gripping my sleeve. "No, sweet girl. Maggie will be here when you get home." But even as I said it, I wondered if it was true. Once the children were in full-time care, what would my role be? Elena had made several pointed comments about transitioning to the next phase and age-appropriate independence that suggested she saw my intensive involvement as a temporary necessity rather than an ongoing benefit. The first day of school arrived with the inevitable chaos of 6 two-year-olds trying to understand why their world was suddenly changing. Elena had hired a car service to transport them, complete with specialized car seats and a driver trained in child safety protocols. The cost probably exceeded what most people spent on their entire vehicles, but money was never the limiting factor in the Pemberton household. I helped dress them in their matching uniforms, navy blue and white outfits that made them look like tiny sailors heading off to some maritime adventure. James cried when I tried to leave him at the school door. Sophia clung to my leg with fierce determination. Lily watched everything with serious eyes that seemed too old for her small face. "Meggie, stay," William said firmly, crossing his arms in a gesture that reminded me so much of his father that I almost laughed despite my own anxiety. "Maggie will pick you up this afternoon," I promised, kissing each small forehead and trying to project confidence I didn't feel. "You're going to learn so many new things and meet new friends." But as I watched them disappear through those institutional doors, escorted by strangers who knew their names from enrollment forms, but nothing about their individual needs and preferences, I felt something break inside my chest. For 2.5 years, I had been their constant, their comfort in the night, their cheerleader during the day, their soft landing when the world felt too big or too scary. Now they were walking into a world where no one knew that Isabella needed her water cup filled exactly half full, or that Sophia wouldn't eat anything green unless it was mixed with something she recognized, or that Lily needed 5 minutes of quiet transition time before any new activity. The house felt too empty without them. I wandered through rooms that had been filled with laughter and crying and the constant motion of 6 small bodies exploring their environment. Elena had gone to her yoga class, then lunch with friends, then shopping in Soho. Alexander was at his office managing investments and attending meetings that would generate more wealth for a family that already had more than they could spend in several lifetimes. And I sat in the pristine nursery, surrounded by toys that no one was playing with and books that no one needed read aloud, feeling like a ghost in my own life. The afternoon pickup revealed what I had feared. James had refused to nap and spent the day in a state of exhausted overstimulation. Sophia had bitten another child during a conflict over toys. Lily had withdrawn completely, spending most of the day in a corner with her thumb in her mouth, a behavior we had successfully eliminated months ago. Isabella had wet herself twice, despite being fully potty-trained at home. Grace had cried inconsolably for the first hour and then fallen into an exhausted sleep that the teachers couldn't wake her from. William had simply stood by the window, asking every adult who passed when Maggie was coming. "They'll adjust," Elena said dismissively when I reported the day's challenges. "It's normal for children to resist change initially. The school assured me they're very experienced with transition difficulties." But over the following weeks, instead of adjusting, The children seemed to become more distressed. Sleep patterns that had been stable for months became erratic. Eating habits changed as stress affected their appetites. The easy laughter and natural curiosity that had characterized their personalities was replaced by clingy behavior and emotional volatility. I tried to discuss my concerns with Elena, but she dismissed them as overprotectiveness. I tried to raise the issues with Alexander, but he was traveling frequently, managing business interests that spanned multiple continents and required constant attention to international markets and currency fluctuations. The crisis came on a Thursday in October. I was preparing their after-school snack when the phone rang. Riverside Academy's director, Dr. Martinez, sounded strained when she asked me to come in for an immediate conference. "There's been an incident," she said carefully. "Nothing serious, but we need to discuss some behavioral concerns." I arrived to find all 6 children sitting in the administrative office, looking small and miserable in their Navy uniforms. James was rocking back and forth, a self-soothing behavior he had abandoned months earlier. Sophia sat perfectly still, which was more alarming than any tantrum would have been. The other 4 clustered together like survivors of some disaster, seeking comfort in each other's familiar presence. "What happened?" I asked, immediately going to them and feeling their small bodies relax as they recognized my voice and scent. Dr. Teresa Martinez, a woman whose credentials were impressive, but whose understanding of individual children seemed limited, launched into a clinical description of the day's events. Apparently, during outdoor play, the 6 siblings had managed to coordinate an escape attempt. While teachers were distracted by other children, they had found a gap in the playground fence and made it 3 blocks before a concerned neighbor recognized them and called the police. Fortunately, no one was hurt, Dr. Martinez concluded, but this level of coordinated defiance suggests some serious adjustment issues. We think it might be beneficial to separate them into different classrooms, possibly different schedules, to encourage individual development. I looked down at 6 faces that had turned to me with absolute trust, expecting me to fix whatever had gone wrong in their carefully ordered world. They had tried to come home. They had tried to get back to the life they understood, and now the proposed solution was to separate them from each other as well. "No," I said quietly. "I'm sorry?" "No, you will not separate them. They're not defiant children, Dr. Martinez. They're displaced children. They're 2 years old, and every element of security in their lives has been disrupted simultaneously. This escape attempt was a cry for help, not a disciplinary problem." Dr. Martinez's expression shifted from professional concern to defensive irritation. "Mrs. Douglas, I understand you've been with the family for some time, but we are trained educators with extensive experience in early childhood development. And I am the person who has loved these 6 children every single day of their lives since they were 4 months old," I replied, my voice rising despite my efforts to maintain composure. "I am the person who knows that James needs physical activity before he can focus on quiet tasks, and Sophia needs clear boundaries delivered with warmth rather than institutional authority. I am the person who understands that Lily processes emotions internally, and William expresses them externally, and separating them from each other would be cruel and counterproductive." The academic setting had given me language for what I'd always known instinctively, but knowledge gained through love carries different weight than knowledge gained through textbooks. "Perhaps," Dr. Martinez said coldly, "the children's attachment to you is part of the problem. Healthy development requires learning to trust multiple caregivers and environments." That's when Isabella, barely 2 years old, looked up at me with tears streaming down her small face and said, "Maggie, I want to go home." Not to Elena or Alexander, who had created this institutional solution to the inconvenience of intensive parenting, not to the beautiful brownstone with its expensive furnishings and imported marble. Home, to her, was wherever I was. I gathered all 6 children into the circle of my arms, feeling their relief as they pressed against me like flowers turning towards sunlight. They smelled like institutional soap and other people's cleaning products instead of the gentle lavender detergent we used at home. Their hair was mussed from playground activities supervised by strangers who didn't know that Grace needed her curls smoothed in a specific pattern to avoid tangles. "Yes, babies," I whispered against 6 small heads. "Let's go home." That evening, I had the most difficult conversation of my professional life. Elena was furious about the school incident, embarrassed by the police involvement, and frustrated by what she saw as my undermining of her parenting decisions. Alexander was caught between his wife's social concerns and the growing evidence that his children were genuinely struggling. "The school is highly regarded," Elena insisted, pacing the living room while I provided damage control upstairs with 6 overtired, emotionally overwhelmed children. "Other families manage the transition just fine. Perhaps Mrs. Douglas has made them too dependent on her." I could hear the conversation through the old heating system that carried voices between floors, and each word felt like a small knife. Too dependent. As if love could be measured in appropriate doses, as if security could be rationed to prevent spoiling. When Alexander finally came up to the nursery, I was sitting in the rocking chair with William asleep in my lap, while the other 5 played quietly with blocks nearby. The scene was peaceful now, but I could see the emotional exhaustion in their small faces. "Maggie," he said softly, "we need to talk." I knew what was coming. I had seen it in Elena's calculating expressions, heard it in the phone conversations about transition strategies and developmental independence. My intensive involvement was being reframed as unhealthy attachment, my 24-hour availability as professional boundary issues. "Of course," I said, carefully transferring William to his bed without waking him. We went to his study, a room lined with financial journals and investment reports, walls covered with awards for business achievement, and photos from charity galas where millionaires gathered to display their philanthropic commitments. The leather chairs probably cost more than most people's furniture budgets, but they felt less comfortable than my creaky basement chair. "The school incident was serious," he began, settling behind his desk in a position that emphasized the professional nature of our conversation. "Elena is concerned that the children's attachment to you is preventing them from developing appropriate independence." "And what do you think?" I asked, meeting his eyes directly. He looked tired, caught between competing priorities and unsure how to balance his wife's social expectations with his children's obvious need for stability. "I think they love you more than they've ever loved anyone, and that's both beautiful and complicated." "Love isn't supposed to be convenient, Mr. Pemberton." The return to formal address was deliberate, a reminder that despite our moment of understanding, the power structure in this relationship had never really changed. I was still the hired help, and my opinion carried weight only when it aligned with decisions that had already been made. "Elena thinks it might be better for everyone if we adjusted your role. Reduced hours, perhaps, more of a part-time position that allows the children to become more independent." I had expected this, but the word still hit like a physical blow. Reduced hours, part-time position. The language of dismissal wrapped in the vocabulary of child development theory. "I see," I said carefully. "And when would this adjustment take effect?" "We were thinking after the holidays. Give them time to settle into their school routine, let them adjust to spending their days away from home, then perhaps evenings and weekends initially." Evenings and weekends. The leftover hours when real parents took over and hired help became unnecessary. I would go from being the person who knew every preference and fear and small need to being the person who showed up for convenient occasions and special events. What about Isabella's night terrors or James's ear infections that require medication every 4 hours? What about Lily's anxiety about new situations and William's need for transition time between activities? "They'll learn to manage," Alexander said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Children are adaptable." "Yes, they are," I agreed. "They adapt by creating coping mechanisms, withdrawal, regression, behavioral difficulties. They adapt by hardening themselves against disappointment and learning not to trust that the people they love will remain available. I stood up, smoothing my uniform skirt and straightening my shoulders. If you've already decided, Mr. Pemberton, then there's no need for further discussion. Just let me know when you'd like me to start reducing my hours. But as I reached the door, his voice stopped me. Maggie, wait. I turned back to find him looking genuinely conflicted. His businessman composure cracked enough to reveal the uncertain father underneath. This isn't what I want, he admitted. But Elena, she's been through a lot. The pregnancy, the complications, the recovery. She needs to feel like she has control over something in her life. And the children, they represent everything she went through to have them. When they turn to you instead of her, it's a reminder of all the time she lost with them. I understood then. This wasn't really about educational development or healthy independence. This was about a mother's guilt and jealousy, about the painful reality that sometimes love can't be purchased or scheduled or mandated by biological connection. I never tried to replace her, I said quietly. I tried to fill the spaces she couldn't fill while she was recovering. That's what good caregivers do. We provide what's needed when it's needed, not to diminish parents, but to support the entire family. I know that, but Elena sees it differently. We stood there for a moment, two adults caught in an impossible situation where someone would inevitably be hurt. Either I would lose my position and the children would lose their primary attachment figure, or Elena would continue to feel displaced in her own home. What if we tried a different approach? I suggested. Instead of reducing my hours, what if we increased Elena's involvement? I could help her learn their routines, their preferences, the little things that make them feel secure. We could work together instead of in competition. Alexander's expression suggested this possibility had never occurred to him. In his business world, professional relationships were typically competitive rather than collaborative. The idea that two women might be able to share the emotional labor of raising 6 children without jealousy or power struggles was apparently foreign to him. Elena she doesn't have your natural instincts with children, he said carefully. She tries, but she gets frustrated easily. When they cry or resist or make messes, she becomes overwhelmed. Because she never learned how to manage those situations, I replied. Parenting isn't instinctual, Mr. Pemberton. It's a skill that develops through practice and patience, and someone teaching you what works. Elena missed the early months when those skills typically develop. That doesn't mean she can't learn them now. I could see him considering this possibility, weighing it against his wife's pride and his own assumptions about maternal capability. She would never agree to being taught by the nanny, he said finally. Then don't call it teaching. Call it collaboration. Call it sharing expertise. Call it whatever preserves her dignity while giving her the tools she needs to connect with her children. That conversation ended without resolution, but it planted seeds that would grow over the following weeks. I continued providing full-time care while Elena struggled with the school's reports about behavioral difficulties and adjustment problems. The children continued coming home exhausted and overstimulated, requiring hours of patient comfort before they could settle into their familiar routines. Something had to change, and eventually, it did. The change came not from family meetings or administrative decisions, but from a moment of crisis that stripped away all the pretense and social positioning. It was a Saturday morning in November, and I was in the kitchen preparing breakfast while Elena supervised the children in the living room. Alexander was in his study, participating in a conference call about emerging markets in Asia. I heard Elena's voice rise to a level of frustration that immediately got my attention. "No, Sophia, put that down. James, stop climbing on the furniture. Isabella, come here right now." 6 2-year-olds being managed by someone who saw their natural behavior as defiance rather than development was a recipe for disaster. I moved toward the living room, but Elena's next words stopped me. "I can't do this," she said, her voice breaking with exhaustion and defeat. "I can't manage all of them at once. They don't listen to me the way they listen to her. They don't want me when they're upset. I'm their mother, but I might as well be a stranger. I found her sitting on the white sofa, surrounded by the controlled chaos of 6 active toddlers, with tears streaming down her perfectly made-up face. The magazine-worthy living room looked like a toy store had exploded. Books scattered, cushions displaced, small shoes abandoned wherever they'd been kicked off. But what I noticed most was that none of the children were going to her for comfort. James had retreated to a corner with his stuffed elephant. Sophia was building an elaborate block tower with fierce concentration. The others were engaged in various activities, but none of them were seeking their mother's attention or approval. "May I?" I asked gently, gesturing toward the chaos. Elena nodded, wiping her eyes with a tissue that probably cost more than most people spent on a box of them. I sat down on the floor, which immediately got everyone's attention. "Good morning, my loves. I see we're having an adventure with all the toys." 6 small faces turned toward me with relief and recognition. But instead of immediately solving their various small conflicts and complaints, I did something different. "James," I said, "your mama is feeling a little sad this morning. Do you think your elephant might help her feel better?" He looked uncertain for a moment, then slowly approached Elena with his most treasured possession extended toward her. When she accepted the stuffed animal with genuine gratitude, his face lit up with pride. "Sophia, your mama doesn't know how to build towers like you do. Could you teach her?" One by one, I facilitated small interactions between Elena and each child, not as their primary caregiver stepping in to manage problems, but as a translator helping them understand each other's languages. What emerged over the next hour was something beautiful and complicated. Elena did love her children, but she had never learned to speak their emotional language. She showed affection through providing material things, expensive clothes, elaborate toys, carefully planned activities. But 2-year-olds need affection shown through presence, patience, and play. When Lily brought Elena a book to read, and Elena actually sat down and read it with dramatic voices that made all 6 children giggle, I saw the connection she had been searching for. When William needed help reaching a toy on a high shelf, and Elena lifted him up rather than just retrieving the toy herself, I saw his face acknowledge her as someone who understood his needs. "They're not difficult children," I said quietly, as the morning's chaos settled into purposeful play. "They're just children who need their worlds to make sense. Consistent responses, clear expectations, and the security of knowing that the adults in their lives will help them navigate challenges rather than punish them for having challenges." Oh, Elena watched Isabella demonstrate how she had learned to put on her own shoes, complete with backwards Velcro and proud satisfaction in her independence. "I always assumed maternal instinct would just happen," Elena said softly. "I thought that because I wanted them so desperately, because we spent so much money and effort to have them, love would automatically translate into knowing how to care for them." "Love is the foundation," I agreed, "but parenting skills are built on that foundation through experience and practice, and learning what works with each individual child. You spent 2 years recovering from their birth and letting others do the hands-on work. That doesn't make you a bad mother. It just means you're starting your practical education now instead of when they were infants." That day marked the beginning of a different dynamic in the Pemberton household. Instead of competition between Elena and me for the children's affection, we began a collaboration that honored both her position as their mother and my experience as their caregiver. Elena started joining me for bedtime routines, learning which songs each child preferred and how to navigate the complex negotiations that preceded sleep. She accompanied us to playground visits, discovering that Grace was fearless on climbing equipment, while Lily preferred quiet activities like collecting interesting leaves. Most importantly, she began to see the children's behaviors as communication rather than defiance. When James had a meltdown about leaving the park, instead of becoming frustrated with his unreasonable reaction, she learned to give him transition warnings and involve him in the decision-making process. The changes weren't immediate or easy, Elena had to overcome years of assuming that wealth could substitute for hands-on involvement. She had to learn patience with developmental phases that couldn't be accelerated through expensive interventions. She had to accept that some aspects of childcare were legitimately difficult and exhausting, rather than evidence of her inadequacy. But gradually, I watched the relationships between Elena and her children deepen and strengthen. Isabella began bringing her drawings to both of us. Sophia included Elena in her elaborate pretend games. William accepted comfort from Elena when I wasn't available, instead of crying until I could respond. The school situation resolved itself as the children became more emotionally secure at home. With both Elena and me providing consistent, loving care, they had the emotional resources to handle the daily separation that school required. Their teachers reported improved behavior, better social interactions, and age-appropriate developmental progress. Alexander watched these changes with something approaching amazement. His business success had been built on clear hierarchies and defined roles, but his family was teaching him that the most important relationships couldn't be managed like corporate structures. "I never thought Elena and you could work together like this," he admitted to me one evening, watching through the window as Elena helped all 6 children plant bulbs in the small garden behind the brownstone. "I assumed it would be territorial." "Women are taught to compete with each other," I replied, folding the day's laundry with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been managing household routines for decades. "But we're also natural collaborators when we're allowed to be. Elena doesn't need me to be less so that she can be more. The children have enough love for both of us. And you? Do you have enough love for all of this? The children, Elena's learning process, the complicated family dynamics?" I paused in my folding, considering the question that touched on the heart of everything I had experienced in this household. Did I have enough love for the complexity of being needed and valued while remaining, fundamentally, an employee rather than a family member? "I have enough love for the children," I said finally. "Everything else. I'm learning to navigate as we go." But even as I said it, I knew that the fundamental structure of my position remained problematic. I was emotionally invested in ways that went far beyond a job description, but legally and socially, I remained hired help who could be dismissed at will. The children called me Maggie and ran to me for comfort, but I would never appear in family photos or be included in holiday celebrations as anything more than a service provider. The contradictions came to a head during Christmas season. Elena had planned an elaborate celebration with extended family visiting from various parts of the country and internationally. The guest list included grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins, a full family reunion to introduce the Sextuplets to their broader family network. My role during this celebration would be to manage the children's schedules, handle meal preparations, and provide childcare while the adults socialized. I would eat in the kitchen while everyone else enjoyed the formal dining room. I would watch the gift exchange from the periphery, helping children unwrap presents but not receiving any myself. "It's always been this way," Elena explained when I asked about the arrangements. "Staff work during family celebrations. That's just how it works." But the children didn't understand these social distinctions. They wanted me to sit beside them during meals. They wanted to give me the drawings and small crafts they had made as gifts. They wanted me to be part of their Christmas celebration, not just the person who made it possible behind the scenes. The morning of Christmas Eve, Isabella brought me a carefully wrapped package that she had obviously prepared with Elena's help. "For Maggie," she said solemnly, placing it in my hands with the reverence children reserve for moments they sense are important. Inside was a framed photo. All 6 children gathered around me in the nursery, taken a few weeks earlier when Elena was learning to navigate the bedtime routine. We were reading a story together, and the photographer had captured a moment of pure contentment. Everyone was smiling, relaxed, genuinely happy. At the bottom of the frame, in Elena's handwriting, were the words, "For Maggie, who taught us that love makes a family." I stood in the kitchen, holding this unexpected acknowledgement, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. Elena had seen me, not just as an employee or a service provider, but as someone whose love had contributed to the family's emotional foundation. "Elena," I said when I found her in the living room, putting finishing touches on decorations that probably cost more than most people's annual Christmas budgets. "Thank you for this." She looked up from arranging flowers that had been flown in from somewhere exotic, her expression soft in a way I rarely saw. "Thank you for teaching me how to love them properly," she replied. "I don't think I could have learned without your help." That Christmas celebration was different from previous years. Instead of being relegated to the kitchen and periphery, I was included in family meals and gift exchanges. Instead of being introduced as the nanny, I was presented as Maggie, who was like family to us. The extended family immediately recognized the children's attachment to me and Elena's obvious respect for my role in their lives. Instead of the awkward social positioning I had expected, I found myself welcomed as someone whose contribution to the family was valued and acknowledged. Alexander's parents, wealthy Boston philanthropists who had initially seemed skeptical about their son's household arrangements, watched me interact with their grandchildren and saw immediately how central I had become to their daily lives. "You're remarkable with them," Alexander's mother said, sitting beside me as I helped James open a particularly complicated toy package. "It's clear they adore you." "They're easy to adore," I replied, watching James's face light up as he discovered the toy fire truck inside layers of expensive wrapping paper. "Alexander tells me you've been with them since they were babies." That kind of consistency must be invaluable for their development. This was the first time any member of the extended family had acknowledged my role as more than temporary childcare, and I felt a warmth that went beyond mere professional validation. But the most significant moment came when Alexander stood up during Christmas dinner to make a toast. He raised his glass of wine that probably cost more than most people's weekly grocery budget and looked around the table at family members who had gathered from multiple continents. "This year," he said, "I want to acknowledge someone who has made our family possible in ways that go far beyond her job description. Maggie has loved our children when we didn't know how to love them ourselves. She has taught us what it means to put their needs first, to see them as individuals rather than projects, to find joy in the small moments that make up their daily lives." He turned toward me, his expression serious but warm. "Elena and I joke that we gave birth to 6 children, but Maggie raised them. That's not entirely true. We're all learning to be the family they deserve. But it wouldn't have been possible without her patience, wisdom, and unconditional love." The room fell quiet as family members absorbed this unexpected acknowledgement. In their world, household staff were typically invisible during family celebrations. Having their son and brother publicly honor a nanny's contribution was unusual, perhaps even socially awkward. But then Alexander's father stood up and raised his own glass. "To Maggie," he said simply, "who has given our grandchildren the most precious gift of all, the security of being truly seen and loved." One by one, the other adults stood and raised their glasses. "To Maggie." I sat there, overwhelmed by this unexpected recognition, feeling tears I hadn't expected to shed. For 3.5 years, I had poured my heart into loving these children and supporting their family, never expecting acknowledgement beyond regular paychecks and the private satisfaction of knowing I was needed. But this moment was about more than personal validation. The 6 children, now 3 years old and old enough to understand the significance of adults raising glasses in toast, looked around the table with proud expressions. "Maggie is family," Grace announced with 3-year-old certainty, and the entire room smiled. That night, after the guests had gone to bed in various guest rooms throughout the large brownstone, I sat in the living room with Elena and Alexander, watching the Christmas tree lights reflect off expensive ornaments, while 6 tired children slept peacefully upstairs. "I need to ask you something," Alexander said, settling into the chair beside me. and I want you to answer honestly, not professionally." I waited, uncertain what was coming. "Are you happy here? Really happy, not just satisfied with your job, but personally fulfilled?" The question surprised me with its directness. In all our conversations about the children's needs and development, about family dynamics and household management, we had rarely discussed my own emotional well-being. "I love the children," I said carefully. "I love being part of their daily lives, watching them grow, helping them navigate challenges. In that sense, yes, I'm happy." "But?" Elena prompted, sensing the qualification in my voice. I looked around the beautiful room, filled with art and furnishings that represented more wealth than I could imagine, and tried to articulate feelings I had barely admitted to myself. "But I'm 73 years old," I said slowly. "I won't be able to provide this level of care indefinitely, and when that time comes, I'll have to leave not just a job, but the only family I have left. The children will grow up and move on with their lives, and I'll become a pleasant memory of their early childhood." The words hung in the air between us, acknowledging realities we had all been avoiding. "I've given everything to this role," I continued. "My time, my energy, my heart, and I don't regret that choice. But sometimes I wonder what will happen to me when I'm no longer needed." Elena and Alexander exchanged a look that suggested they had discussed this possibility, perhaps more than once. "What if," Elena said carefully, "you didn't have to leave when you can no longer provide full-time care? What if we found a way for you to remain part of their lives, part of our family, even as your role changes?" I looked at her skeptically. Wealthy families were notorious for discarding household staff when their usefulness ended, despite years of loyalty and service. Promises made in emotional moments were often forgotten when practical decisions needed to be made. "Elena," Alexander said, reaching into his jacket pocket, "show her the documents we discussed." Elena retrieved a folder from the side table and handed it to me. Inside were legal papers that took me several minutes to understand fully. It was a trust fund, established in my name, funded with enough money to ensure financial security for the rest of my life. But more than that, it included provisions for housing, a small apartment in a property the Pembertons owned in Brooklyn, close enough to remain involved in the children's lives, but independent enough to maintain dignity and autonomy. "We've been working on this for months," Alexander explained, "ever since we realized how integral you've become to our family. This isn't charity, Maggie. It's recognition that your contribution goes far beyond any salary we could pay." I stared at the documents, trying to process the magnitude of what they were offering. Financial security, a permanent home, continued connection to the children I loved. Legal protection that would prevent future dismissal or displacement. "Why?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Because," Elena said, reaching over to touch my hand, "you taught me that family isn't just about blood or marriage or legal documents. It's about choosing to love someone unconditionally, day after day, year after year. You chose our children. Now we're choosing you." That night, lying in my basement room for what I expected might be one of the last times, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. I had arrived in this household as a desperate 70-year-old woman with no savings, no family, and no prospects beyond this single job opportunity. I was leaving my position as someone valued, acknowledged, and permanently welcomed into a family that had learned to see beyond traditional boundaries of class and employment. The children's love had healed something in me that I hadn't expected to heal. Their daily needs had given my life structure and purpose when I thought both were gone forever. Their growth and development had provided me with meaning that went far deeper than any career achievement. But perhaps most importantly, this experience had taught me that love can create families in unexpected ways, that care and commitment can transcend social boundaries, that sometimes the people who need us most are the ones who can give us exactly what we need in return. 6 months later, I moved into my apartment in Brooklyn, a bright, comfortable space with a view of the East River and easy subway access to Manhattan. The children visit regularly, sometimes with Elena and Alexander, sometimes brought by car service for afternoon adventures in my new neighborhood. They're 4 years old now, full of questions and observations and the confident independence that comes from knowing they are securely loved. Isabella is learning to read and brings me books she wants to share. James has discovered a passion for building elaborate structures with blocks and Legos. Sophia is the family diplomat, helping resolve conflicts between siblings with wisdom that seems beyond her years. Lily has maintained her quiet, observant nature, but has developed a love of art that fills my refrigerator with colorful drawings. Grace is taking dance classes and performs elaborate shows in my living room whenever she visits. William remains the family philosopher, asking questions about everything from why leaves change colors to where people go when they die. Elena has grown into the mother role with grace and confidence, no longer competing for her children's affection, but secure in her own unique relationship with each of them. Alexander has learned to balance his business responsibilities with present-moment fathering, often working from home so he can be available for school pickups and playground visits. And I have learned that retirement doesn't have to mean irrelevance, that aging doesn't require invisibility, and that family can be created through choice rather than circumstance. The trust fund provides more than financial security. It provides dignity. I am no longer an employee dependent on others' charity, but a family member whose contributions have been formally recognized and permanently valued. The legal documents ensure that my connection to these children cannot be severed by future disagreements or changes in family circumstances. But more than that, the arrangement acknowledges something revolutionary, that domestic workers, caregivers, and others who provide emotional labor deserve recognition, security, and respect for the essential role we play in creating healthy families and communities. Last week, Isabella asked me if I was her grandmother. "Well," I said, helping her arrange flowers in a vase on my kitchen table, "I'm not your biological grandmother, but I'm someone who loves you like a grandmother, who has been part of your life since you were tiny, who will always be here when you need me." "So you're my heart grandmother," she said with 4-year-old logic. Heart grandmother. I have been called many things in my 74 years: daughter, wife, mother, employee, caregiver, nanny. But heart grandmother might be the most accurate description of who I have become. I think about my own daughter, Sarah, sometimes, wondering if she would approve of how I've built a new family from the pieces of my broken heart. I think she would understand that love doesn't diminish when it's shared, that the maternal feelings I couldn't express after her death have found worthy recipients in 6 small people who needed exactly the fierce, protective, unconditional love I had to offer. This week, Elena called to tell me that she and Alexander are considering having another child. The Sextuplets are thriving, their family has found its rhythm, and they're feeling confident about their parenting abilities. "We'd want you involved from the beginning this time," she said, "not as emergency help, but as family planning our expansion together." The idea of another baby, or babies given their family's tendency toward multiples, fills me with excitement rather than exhaustion. I am older now, but I'm also more secure, more valued, more integrated into their lives in sustainable ways. I have learned that love is not a finite resource that gets depleted through sharing. Instead, it multiplies when it's given freely and received gratefully. The love I gave to Sarah, the love I thought died with her, has grown exponentially through my relationship with Isaac, Sophia, Lily, Grace, James, and William. They have taught me that families can be created through commitment rather than biology, that security comes from being truly needed rather than merely employed, and that the most profound relationships often develop in the most unexpected circumstances. Do you know what it feels like to be valued for who you are rather than just what you provide? Have you ever experienced love that transcends traditional boundaries of class, age, or social expectation? Have you found family in places you never expected to look? These are the questions I think about as I watch the river flow past my apartment window, as I prepare for visits from 6 young voices calling Heart Grandma Maggie as they race up my front steps. Tell me in the comments, have you ever found yourself loving someone else's child as fiercely as your own? Have you experienced the complicated joy of being needed by people whose worlds are very different from yours? Have you discovered that sometimes the most broken hearts can heal in the most unexpected ways? If this story touched something in your heart, please like and subscribe. Your engagement helps stories like mine reach other women who understand the complexity of loving across boundaries, of finding purpose in service, of discovering that family is created through daily acts of care rather than legal documents or DNA. We've prepared more storytelling that explores the deep connections that can develop between caregivers and families, the challenges of loving across class differences, and the unexpected ways that broken hearts can heal. You can find these continuing stories by clicking on the left. Thank you for listening to my story, for understanding that love can bloom in the most unlikely soil, and for believing that every person who cares for children with dedication and tenderness deserves recognition, security, and respect. I'll see you in the next story where we'll explore more of the complicated, beautiful, heartbreaking, and ultimately healing relationships that shape our lives in ways we never expected. Until then, remember that your love matters, your dedication is valuable, and your story deserves to be heard.